Hey everyone, welcome to another interview. This week we have David Congdon, who's written a few different books, which we're very excited to talk about. He wrote The Mission of Demythologizing, Rudolf Bultmann's Dialectical Theology. He's written two other intro guides to Bultmann. And then most recently, and this is the book we're focusing on today, The God Who Saves, a Dogmatic Sketch. David, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
No worries. So you're joining us from over in the States right now. I've got to wonder, what's it like being in the US? I mean, we're all watching from afar as things seem to be unraveling fast, but what's it like being on the ground?
It's an odd time. I mean, I think we're seeing, I grew up within the evangelical community. So I come out of the church world that is right now seemingly most on the side of Trump. So, I mean, I didn't come out. I mean, that's not my home community. They're not necessarily on the side of Trump, but I understand their concerns and I understand their ways of thinking. But it upsets me and it concerns me. It concerns me especially just the wedding of church and political power. And so, and we're seeing a lot of these evangelical institutions unraveling or internally in conflict as a result of all of these political issues. So it's a difficult time. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I know it's not really on the topic of what we're talking about today,
but it's important.
It's what's happening. Yeah. Well, let's get to the book, The God Who Saves, which is out now and people can order through Book Depository or Amazon or however you're going to go about it. I recommend that. I was just saying to David that mine's on its way. It's on a ship somewhere across or maybe it's on a plane, hopefully a plane.
Could take a while.
Yeah, boat might be a problem, actually, yeah. But in it, it's a universalism approach. So let's get into universalism because there's a few general responses I think we find to the idea that I've come across. Compared to the people who embrace it fully, the different responses might be like there's kind of a fundamental knee-jerk opposition, which is like, nope, that's not Christian. You can't hold it at all. Which is kind of like some of the response that Rob Bell experienced post Love Wins. The second of those who say universalism, that feels true, like that feels good, I'd like that, it doesn't make me wince, but then they don't know how to exactly defend it or argue it, and so they just kind of keep it to themselves. And then the third somewhat related response is people who's like, yeah, we'd all like to believe that, but we can either be true or nice. And so that's from what I've experienced. So coming out of that, perhaps you could tell us a little about what universalism means or what that is about, and maybe your personal journey that led you to this book.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so universalism can be defined in different ways, and I do go into that typology, the first chapter of my book, in order to differentiate different kinds of universalism. I'm specifically talking about a Christian universalism, and by that I mean one that doesn't reject or negate the Christian claim that Jesus saves. So that's typically the response to universalism. Oh, well, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Clearly, we're done. Universalism has to be false, something like that. I came into theology via the work of Karl Barth. I went to Princeton Seminary as an MDiv student, and when I encountered Barth's writings and his theology, it was clear to me that he, while not espousing universalism directly, that's a debate for another time maybe, but he certainly articulated a basis for reaching universalism with his account of Christology and his understanding of Jesus Christ as the one who is both the rejected and the one who is elected, and that we're all elect in him. And this was a way of understanding, of upholding both the centrality of Christ as the Savior of all, as the exclusive Savior of all, and the universal scope of that grace and that salvation in him. So with Barth, you didn't have to pick between a universal grace and a genuinely Christological, Christocentric conception of Christianity and religion. So you could have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. And that was really attractive. It opened up new vistas and pathways for me. I ultimately came to disagree with Barth on certain issues, which I outline in the book. But I remain convinced by what I was convinced by when I first encountered him. That is, there's something right in that and what Barth was doing. There's something true there. We might want to articulate it differently, which I try to, but fundamentally, I want to say that Jesus Christ is the exclusive Savior. So salvation happens through him. And yet I want to affirm that all are saved, and crucially, irrespective of an individual's belief or non-belief in Jesus. That's where things get tricky. And it's how you get to that point that people start to differ. So what this means is I would disagree with something like a pluralistic conception of universalism, where all religions are separate paths to God. I would deny that, although I would affirm the kind of overarching intention of that framework of thinking. I would just have a different path to getting there, one that goes through Christ. But yes, I would deny that. But there are other ways of articulating it that I would differ with certain Barthian scholars, but nevertheless affirm the overall arching position.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I'm very excited to see how that unpacks as we get along. So you've said in the book it's a dogmatic sketch, or dogmatics in outline, but one which is controlled through a specific claim that salvation, rather than Trinity or Christology or human experience, is the orienting center or the guiding norm of Christian theology. That's the lens through which it all happens. To know God is to know the God who saves. Could you elaborate on why you feel that salvation provides that most appropriate lens for our God talk?
This again is a offshoot of my interest in Barth. I mean, what Barth did in theology is to articulate the idea that we only know God with respect to what God does, what God's action in time and history. Revelation is our only pathway to knowledge of God. Now, the issue here is, what is the content of that revelation? Barth, I would say Barth actually has himself a kind of what I call a soteriocentric conception of God and theology. But he articulates it in different ways. So early on in his early work, he's very much, actually very similar to the position I actually articulate. So my work is very similar to the early Barth's work, but we can talk about that later perhaps. But later on, what Barth does, he becomes Christocentric. He focuses on Jesus Christ, right, as the starting point for a talk about God. But he places that talk of Jesus Christ in distinction from soteriology. And the reason Barth does that is because he's fearful of those liberal theologians who would use a salvation-centric approach to theology to get human experience in through the back door, so to speak, and then liberalism takes over, and Barth's fear of Schleiermacher and the rest becomes manifest. So Barth wants very strongly to avoid letting human experience determine our talk of God. And he does so by really emphasizing the history of Jesus Christ, the man Jesus, and in its contours in the Gospels, and that history, letting that be the norm. What I would do is basically say, Barth was right to make Christ central, but Christ's centrality is a salvific centrality. We can't isolate who Christ is from what he accomplishes, what his purpose is in the world. And I'm not unique in saying that. I'm actually just repeating what Eberhard Jungel, one of Barth's most famous interpreters, has already said. Jungel has a critique of Barth in his book on justification, and Jungel's critique concerns Barth's claim that the Lutheran idea that justification is the doctrine by which the church stands or falls. Barth says that's wrong. It's Christology. So he has this kind of disjunction between Christology as the doctrine upon which church stands or falls and justification. And Jungel says this can't be the case. This can't work. Either your Christology is a Christology informed by justification, either it's a Christology that is a justification Christology, or something else. But you can't separate Christology from the work that Christ accomplishes. The separation of person and work, which is implied in that schema, is impossible. So either Christ's person is united with the work, in which case to talk about the work is to talk about the person. So by calling my approach a soteriocentric one, a salvation-focused one, I just mean to avoid that temptation to separate the person and work of Christ. So I'm not saying that there is no person, of course. There clearly is a person, but that person, we can only access who Christ is via the work that he accomplishes. So it's his significance for us that is our entryway into our talk of God. That's basically what I'm talking about.
That's great. Yeah, that's really helpful to clear that up. Now, you mentioned in the book also that the church has never had like a unified or set position or dogma on atonement, on how that salvation occurs. And I think there'd be a lot of people who are surprised with that, because we've often grown up, especially in certain models, the evangelical church, which is like, no, there is one model. It's the penal substitutionary atonement. And then maybe there's a little room for wriggle in exactly how you interpret that. But that's set up often as this is the church's position. And you say actually that the church needs to ask anew the questions such as, what does it mean for God to save? Or what does it mean for us to be saved? We need to ask that anew in each generation. How do you think your book functions in this space? And how can we create opportunities for our communities to ask these questions anew?
Yeah, well, there isn't a dogma on salvation just by virtue. If you look at the creeds, it will say Christ is for us and for our salvation, but there's no articulation of what that salvation, what the mechanism is there. So that idea is just a fact of our tradition, which has been borne out by the fact that we have these intense disputes over salvation throughout history. Is it deification? Is it justification? Is it whatever it might be?
Yeah.
I think the history of Christianity just demonstrates that these disputes are always ongoing. And it's part of the vitality of Christianity that we continue to have this conversation, that there isn't just one way of articulating this that we're bound to. And I think that openness is actually part of the genius and the great the greatness of Christianity, that it allows for fruitful dialogue on this core issue of our faith. So now, in terms of the need to ask this ever anew, part of my argument is that there's a tendency to want to kind of nail this down. We have one final, ultimate explanation, and this has to be true for all people, for all times, and we can't have disagreement about it. So that hence you have the multiplicity of confessions out there that try to nail this down. And so you belong to this confession, you belong to that confession. My book is an argument for the plurality of theology, that the attempt to nail down Christian faith or theology to a specific account of salvation and say, and this alone is the right account, is, in my opinion, a violation of Revelation, because Revelation is an event in my understanding. It's not a statement or a text or whatever. It's an ever new encounter with God. It's a reality that encounters us anew. So to fix that into a single form is, in fact, to kill it. It's to deny its vitality, its power, and ultimately its ongoing significance for us and for the world. So I think it's actually crucial for theology to find ways of articulating its understanding of Christian faith and identity in a way that remains perpetually open to new interpretations ever again. Part of my work is in the field of hermeneutics and in Rudolf Bultmann's legacy. And part of what I take to be the great insight of Bultmann was precisely this point, that every generation has to understand anew what this gospel is. And that what the interpretation I might put out right now will have to be reinterpreted, criticized, and explored again by someone else. So I offer this book really as a token in that toward that conversation. Say, this is not what everyone needs to believe necessarily at all. This is an opportunity to further engage in thoughtful, faithful, critical reflection on the reality of Christ. And in that sense, hopefully to generate ever anew ongoing dialogue in community with others.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that a lot. I think that's something that, we can try to be looking to promote in our conversations in our churches. And speaking of like our churches and our Christian living, I'm wondering how you feel some of the ways maybe that this universal eschatological salvation affects Christian living today. One of the little thoughts I had was just when you were talking about how we understand God in God's work, in that a lot of our worship seems to be about, particularly in contemporary worship styles, about praising God in God's self, very much like, God, you're really this great, like up there and kind of completely removed from what the action that you have taken. So that was one thought that came to mind, but I don't know what you've thought. What's about the way, universal eschatological salvation affects Christian living?
Well, I think the first thing I would say would be to emphasize, part of my whole approach is to really stress the missionary nature of Christian faith and life. So I go in, that's part of the reason why my book is called The Mission of Demythologizing, my first book, and why my ecclesiology chapter in my new book is ultimately a missionary ecclesiology. But and the reason for that is so in my understanding of the church and of Christian life, faith is about being sent out of ourselves, to be on the move. Part of my understanding of faith and revelation is that there's an ongoing disruption of our life. That the encounter with God is one that thrusts us out of ourselves and out into the world, always to be sent in that missionary movement, ongoing encounter with others. So I would want to say that I want to rethink how worship functions in the life of the church. I think actually it's a crucial mistake actually to view worship as the central defining feature of the Christian gathering. Actually, I think that worship should only function insofar as it actually sends us out to others. So gathering together is not the pinnacle, the climax of Christian life. It's actually in our dispersal, in our movement outwards. And in that sense, so rethinking the function of things like communal gathering and worship would be part of what I would want to say about this. But also, just to step back for a moment and think about just universalism more generally, part of my attraction to universalism was precisely as to overcome the theological approach that I was given when I was raised, and that was faith is the way to save you from hell, right? Faith is, you need faith because if you don't believe, something terrible and eternal will happen to you that you really want to avoid. So believe or else. And universalism of some kind, whatever kind you end up going with, I think some kind of it is true, but it's true in large part, I feel like, because it is more faithful to the truth that faith is not to get it's not insurance, with respect to some future outcome. It's a response to what God has done. This is very clear in the New Testament. You believe because Christ did this for you. And so in that regard, universalism understands that our evangelistic enterprise, our missionary work, it's not about you need this or else, but rather God did this, so therefore. Right? It's an obedient response to this gift, this reality. And that's why I'm not at all anxious about how many people have been saved or how many, these kinds of questions are irrelevant because the point is rather trying to live into the truth of our existence right now that has been secured by God and is continually confronting us again and again. And so I wanted to say that nobody is saved, right? Insofar as I have some sort of secure, permanent bulwark against, future damage or future harms in eternity. Rather, salvation is simply that mode of existence in which one lives in response to and in relationship with this reality of God. And so we are constantly having to evangelize ourselves first and foremost. And out of that self-evangelism, we can share our life with others and draw others into that existence, not because they need it, but because they'll be attracted to it and want to participate in that life together. So I think a universal approach to these things has a deeply and profoundly positive impact upon our mission and our life together as the church.
That is awesome. I love that. I got emotional in that response. That was great. Because I think so often, like, we have this, great fear of mission if you've kind of left a more conservative thing, because you're like, oh, it's about going and saving souls, and I have to go and like tell people. And then there's also a lot of guilt associated with your own Christian life, because you're like, oh, did I miss an opportunity to save that person from eternal torment because I didn't go and sit next to them on the bus and tell them that Jesus can be their Lord and Savior? Like, this is, and this.
Yeah, I refer to that actually explicitly in my book. That sense of this overwhelming, impossible burden that we end up having to bear, a burden that just, it would crush any person who thought about it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And it becomes actually a much more beautiful picture of an invitation to a certain kind of life that creates this picture of a beautiful kingdom and of shalom. So that's really exceptional. Thank you for that. So just one kind of final thought, I guess, is coming out of this. Sorry, I got a little distracted. The idea that this kind of is an apocalyptic idea. Could you maybe explain that? Because again, like, I feel like we've used salvation, which we already said, that already makes people a bit nervous sometimes, and we try to water down that word, that like, oh, we're really saved. And then apocalyptic is just, okay, now I'm really scared and running for the door. Could you maybe just talk a little about that, just as we...
Yeah, sure. I mean, apocalyptic is the running thread throughout the whole work. So so just to step back and explain what this means. So some people hear apocalypse and they think, left behind or some sort of, dispensational fantasy about this rapture is going to come in my lifetime or something. I am using apocalyptic in terms of the kind of New Testament scholarship in the last 50 years or so has begun to recover this idea. The history goes back to the late 1800s. So for a long time in modern biblical scholarship, the idea that Christ was speaking about an eschatological kingdom wasn't really given much credence. Actually, they had kind of reduced it to this community of social community of the church. And some scholars in Germany, Johannes Weiss in particular, realized, well, no, actually, Jesus is actually speaking about this literal eschatological kingdom. And so people began to think about, okay, how does that reshape how we understand these gospel texts and everything that goes along with that? Well, you fast forward, people knew about that, but didn't really care. Ernst Käsemann in the 1950s and 60s really begins to recover the idea of apocalyptic as being central to theology and faith. My work is indebted both to Bultmann and Käsemann, who debated about this issue, but especially to J. Lewis Martin, who was a scholar who was at Union Seminary in New York City. And Martin's work, especially his Galatians commentary and his work on Paul, was really crucial for recovering the idea of apocalyptic that wasn't just about some future imminent kingdom that's on the horizon here, but rather this notion of what I would call kind of an existential event, this eschatological event that encounters us. So Martin understands Paul in Galatians to be a thoroughly apocalyptic theologian. It's not an apocalypse that you would see visually. It's not like there's earthquake here and there's a comet striking the earth, whatever. It's an apocalypse internally, that I have died, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This death of the old self and this new creation of this new self. That's the apocalypse. That there's an age has ended, and now a new age has arrived. That's essentially what we mean by apocalyptic nowadays. So So basically, apocalyptic comes down to these two basic ideas. One, that there's a new age, something new has happened, a totally new reality, and two, it comes from God. It's a divinely enacted, divinely given reality that we don't manufacture or create or contribute to, but it's received. So what I do is I take that eschatological framework, and I go through all the New Testament data and kind of understand the texts. But I draw from that a theological understanding, and specifically, I marshal some resources from other folks, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Bultmann, other folks, Jungel especially, and to understand this event of faith as an apocalypse, as this event that we are, in a sense, recreated. We're created anew, and my main contribution to that whole conversation is to say this can happen unconsciously. That's so. This whole book is an attempt to solve a dilemma for me. That is, on the one hand, I've always been convinced by Barth's understanding of universal grace, the universality of grace in Christ. But I was also convinced by Bultmann and others that Barth made a mistake in his attempt to speak about that grace as being something that affected us in the abstract. So he would talk about our human nature kind of being separate from us in Christ from all eternity. So there was kind of like this, our human essence was located in him. It was just kind of odd metaphysics that was required, almost kind of Platonic. There's like my substance, but then there's like this real substance that I'm participating in. So I never could square that metaphysical structure with the claim that Barth was making. And I was really convinced by Bultmann and others that somehow this reality has to kind of meet me personally, has to confront me. Like my history, my existence matters.
Yeah.
But how does it matter? Well, if you say that what I do, like my personal act of faith and belief, if you say that is significant to save, then you run into the problem of this issue of I contribute to my salvation, that I am actually effecting this new reality. And that would undermine the apocalypse, right? The fact that it's divinely given, it's a truly divine event. So how do you hold on to the notion that it's a fully and exclusively divine gift, divine act, and that it confronts me and meets me personally? So the way I thread those together, as I draw on some work by Jungel and Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer has this notion of unconscious Christianity. It appears especially in his later writings, his Ethics and his Letters from Prison. Doesn't say a whole lot about it. I take that idea that appears in the margins of Bonhoeffer and I kind of run with it. And so I say, what would it look like if we understood faith as an unconscious event? And what I mean by that is, so Bonhoeffer refers to it. I go into it, but the kind of Matthew 25 parable about, you did it to the least of these, you did it to him. Taking some of those insights to kind of this anonymous character that we don't know what we're doing, but we're doing it anyway. And then understanding faith, not simply as a propositional, I believe this, this, and this, or I personally have fidelity to this, rather faith is understood eschatologically to be this movement out of ourselves, this being placed beyond ourselves. Luther has this idea that faith is being placed outside of ourselves. And so I say, okay, if we take that idea of faith being placed outside of ourselves, understand that displacement as the apocalypse, then we have all the pieces in place to understand how each person in his or her existence finds him or herself displaced in moments of encounter with what we would say theologically with God, but they may not know that themselves at the conscious level.
Mm.
So unconsciously, they're encountering God and responding to God. But we would then say, but then the conscious community of faith theologically would then interpret that event and say they've encountered God, and that's how we can say that retrospectively. So that's kind of how that's a taste of what I go into. But basically, so I'm trying to. I'm reworking apocalyptic theology in a universalist way,
Yeah.
which hasn't been done, but this is my attempt to do so.
That's awesome. Hey, so that's why everyone needs to go get the book, because it hasn't been done and someone's attempting something new, and that's great. So The God Who Saves, you can get Amazon, Book Depository, however you do, go buy it, then rate, review, all those kind of things that helps the book get noticed. David, any other ways that people can connect with your work or what you're doing?
I have a website, dwcongdon.com.
Yep.
I occasionally blog at The Fire and the Rose. And yeah, otherwise, I'm on Twitter a lot. So DW Congdon, I tweet there regularly. So
David's a good follow. I've enjoyed that. So yeah, get on that and just get on Twitter, people. And it's so much better than Facebook.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to exploring this text in our groups. And just really appreciate the time you took to write it and the time you've taken to be with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
No worries. Thank you.